In this next exercise, we are going to create a screen that allows us to compare the items that we've selected. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a screen. We're then going to put a gallery inside the screen and we're going to configure it in the way that helps us the most. We're then going to remove and add controls to and from this gallery. We're also going to highlight a selected device and then also add an icon to allow us to navigate back to the first screen. Finally, we'll test the app and also I will invite you to test it on a mobile device. Finally, the task that you can do is to share the app, but if you're using a development environment for yourself, then you may find that a bit more challenging because the intention of a development environment is for it to be just for yourself to use. So let's start with adding a screen. In order to do that, we need to go to Insert, New Screen. In this case, we'd like a blank screen. The screen is defaulting to screen 1. If I go onto the tree view, you can see it's called screen 1. We can hit the drop down and click rename, or on the right hand side we can rename it and we can call it compare screen. We're now going to navigate back to the main screen, and what we're going to do is put our first button onto the screen. So what we can do is we can go onto the plus and we can go and get a button and drag it onto the screen as follows. Just move that across into position. We're actually going to change the size here a little bit because what we need to do is go onto the text property of the button, and we're actually going to say that we actually want to compare. And we're actually going to do a count of the number of items that we want to compare. So we'll say ampersand count rows. And we need to count it from our compare list. So currently it says compare 0. And what we can then do is we can do ampersand item and do brackets. In fact, that's obviously not written correctly because what we need to do is put a quote and close it with another quote, and then that will work correctly. I do need to pop in another little space there, and that will be absolutely fine at this point. And it is quite a nice experience to actually type the formula in because the IntelliSense starts to work for you. But if that doesn't work, you can always copy from the instructions that you've been given. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to work out whether or not we want the button to work or not. Now if we haven't counted anything, then there'll be no point to go to a compare list. So if we actually go onto the property of this button, and it is the display mode. Now currently the display mode is display mode edit, which for a button means that you can click it. Now what we want to do on this is we want to say, well, if count rows of the compare list, and we'll say is greater than 0, then display mode dot edit. Otherwise, display mode dot disabled. And what you can see is that now that this button wouldn't be clickable. You can see there. But if we add one item in there, you can see that it's now clickable. That was the purpose of doing this. Now following on from this, we're actually going to go onto this and we're going to do a Control-C. You can actually right-click and copy it. And that would be one way of doing it, or you could do Control-C. And then we're going to click on an empty space there. If I do Control-V, or if I paste it that way, Control-V, it will paste it in, or you could right click and paste it as well. That would be another way of getting it onto the screen. So we've got another button, but actually what we want to do with this particular button is we want to actually reset it. So what we're going to do on that is we're actually going to say, was on select, I want you to remove from the compare list. And in fact, remove would have to be, there'd be a conditional to that. So in fact, for a collection, all we need to do is clear. And we can see that in operation here. If I go onto the play mode and click on compare one items, in fact, I'll change that as well. You can see that we can get rid of that. So what we need to do now is we need to change the text on that, and we can change that to quote clear selection, and then in the quote. That will work correctly. Now what we need to do is on the button where we compare one item is we want to say what happens on that button. So what we'll do is we will go on to, we've selected the button, we now click on action, we'll navigate, and it will offer us the compare screen. Select that, and that's exactly what it'll do. Now it is actually a little bit easier to actually look on the on select, because we can see that it says navigate to the compare screen and then fade. So that's exactly what it'll do. Click on that and it'll navigate to this screen. Now this screen doesn't have anything in it yet, so we'll need to configure that. What we're now going to do is we're going to take some items from the main screen, and what we've got is we've got a user label here. So let's call it user label. And we've also got a header label. We've got those two items there. So I'm going to select the user label and I'm going to select the header label. Then I'm going to right click and we're going to copy it, move over to the compare screen and then paste that in. And those items will be in the same space there. What we can now do is we can move on to the device gallery, and we can do a similar operation there. So we'll go onto there and we will copy it, then we'll move on to the compare screen, and then we will paste those in. But this time, you know, it doesn't actually have it's not looking at our compare list, it's actually looking at the original list. It's not filtered down at all. What we're going to do is we're going to call this the compare list gallery. And later on we will configure this to our needs in task 3. So far we have added the screen in task 1. We're now going to move over to configuring the gallery to our needs to look at the items that we would like to compare. To do that, it's fairly straightforward. Go on to the compare list gallery, and instead of it showing the items, we can actually look at the compare list. That will show just one item, or as many items as you have selected already. As I don't have a navigation button at the moment, I'm going to move on to the main screen, and I'm actually going to select a few more items, compare, and then go on to Sony and then compare, and then I can go on to compare 3 items, and we can see my 3 items are shown. In this next task, we're going to remove some of the controls from the gallery and add some controls into the gallery. As you can see, we have got the gallery here, and there's actually a compare checkbox, and we don't need that. So we can just right click and we can cut that, or we could just have clicked on it and just press the delete button, or even removed it from the using the tree view. What we can do here is we can actually add a few bits and pieces just by copying and pasting. So if I do Control C, Control V, that will then respect the same formatting of the item that I was looking at, and we can look at this and we can change it to this item.manufacturer. So that will give us the manufacturer name. And in fact, that if we were interested in comparing the memory of these items, what we'd then be able to do is to make it this item.memory, and then that would provide us with a good comparison there. It's worth noting that we can select all the items here, and if we actually right click on them, if you go at align and you do align vertically, then they will distribute themselves essentially mathematically perfectly across each other, so that the gaps between them are actually the same. What we're now going to do is we're going to highlight the selected device, and we've actually done this before, so it should be a fairly straightforward exercise for us. So if we look at our gallery, we can click on the actual template here, and what we can go on to do is to, instead of looking at the items, we can look at the template fill. At the moment it says RGBA 0000, but we can actually make it if this item dot is selected, then we can make it and we can reference the header here. So if I actually select this here, the header label 1, and type it in here, header label 1 dot fill. Now it's not quite right yet, because what we need to do is put the color fade around that. Color fade, header label 1 fill, comma, and then we'll say 75%, and then close the brackets. And then we need to close the brackets on the if statement as well, and we should find that it should actually work correctly. So we can now click on that, and we can see them. We can see the item that we selected as having been highlighted. In task 5, we're going to add a very useful icon to enable us to navigate back to the first screen. I'm actually on the compare screen at the moment, so if I click the X because I was in preview mode, what I can do is I can go on to insert and then go to icons. Now I can scroll all the way down to the one which selects left, or I can just select any icon, and then what I can do is I can go and search for it, and I know this one is called left, and I can select left, and you can see that this has actually got the arrow pointing to the left. All I need to do now is to move this up and then make sure the size is correct, and then go onto the color property, make that white. And what we could also do, because it's going right up to the boundary here, it might be nicer if we actually do a top and bottom padding, just so it sits inside a little bit nicer, and that will work well for us. The final thing to do is to go on to the on select property, and then just use a function called back, open brackets, close brackets, and then that will allow us to make that work. Do be careful that sometimes if you didn't actually navigate to it correctly, it may not work. So if we go back to the main screen and then click on the play, and then we'll go compare these two items, we'll see that we can actually navigate back using the button that we just created. Task 6 is a pretty simple exercise of testing our app, and there are a number of ways of doing this. The first way is to test it as we've been doing it already, and that is by actually just moving out of the edit mode into the play and review mode, and then testing it that way. And the other way is actually to go to the app and to actually use it as if you were any user within your organization. So this is the version where we can see ourselves testing it already. So all we do is we move up into the top right area, and then we can clear our selection. Clearly we can't compare any items, select a couple of items, perhaps even from a different manufacturer, and then click compare 3 items. We can see our app is actually working. What I can then do is actually just go file and save, because I know that when I click the publish option, I will then get an option to share it, which actually gets me to the place I need to get to. So I'm going to click share on that, and if I just jump out of that, because we'll look at sharing later, I can actually see there's a web link here. So if I click on the web link, that will actually take us through to a full view of what the app would be like for a user. Now there is one final pro tip on that, and that is where if we actually look at this and we actually just add, so here we can just add and hide navbar equals true, and then what we'll see is if we actually hit the enter on that, we'll open up the app again, and the navbar will no longer be showing. The next part of this exercise is to actually test the app on a mobile device, and that really is no more than getting the Power Apps app onto your phone, authenticate using your username and password, and then navigating to your app and then seeing it working. The final part of this exercise is to share the app with your fellow co-workers. To do that, I'm actually going to start from the office location. I'm going to move directly to make.powerapps.com, and what you'll see is we need to move to the correct environment. So head off to that environment, then move across to apps, and then you can see the 3 dots for the device ordering app, and you've got the option to share it in this area here. Then what we can do is we can see that I can share it with different people in the organization. Now, I'm actually going to remove that person for just to begin with, and then I'm going to reshare it with them. So I can now share it with Tester. And I could make them a co-owner, although in this instance it might not work because this is my development environment. And now I can click on share, and then that will be shared to that co-worker. That brings us to the end of this exercise. We saw that we were able to add a compare screen. We added the screen. We were able to configure the gallery. We were then able to remove and add controls to that gallery, as well as highlighting the selected device by using the color fade property. And we then were able to add an icon to allow us to navigate back to the very first screen. And we finished up with some important points such as testing the app. We saw 2 different ways of testing it, as well as having a small discussion on testing it on a mobile device. And finally, we saw how we were able to share the app with each other. So that brings us to the end of this lab. We've created a Canvas app in Power Apps, and we actually connected it to an Excel spreadsheet. In the future, we might choose to connect it to a database of some kind. That would be a more typical way of doing this. So the first thing that we did was we created the app. Secondly, we added a series of galleries to the app. And finally, we added a compare screen so that we could compare different products to each other. We hope you've enjoyed this lab, and do let us know if you have any questions.